February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima, Pacific Ocean. The volcanic island trembled under a sky of black smoke and blood-red fire. Waves of U.S. Marines stormed the beaches, their boots sinking into the ash-like sand as machine guns from hidden Japanese pillboxes tore through the first ranks. The air was thick with sulfur and the smell of burning oil, a hellscape that no soldier could have imagined. In the chaos, a new and terrible sound began to rise, the deep hiss of compressed fuel, followed by a guttural roar that swallowed every other noise on the battlefield. Flames erupted like the breath of a living beast, crawling across trenches and into caves where the enemy hid. The Japanese soldiers who had sworn never to surrender froze in paralyzing terror as fire rolled toward them, liquid, unstoppable, and alive. It wasn't just heat. It was fear turned into a weapon. The flamethrower, carried by men known as human torches, unleashed something far beyond ordinary destruction. It stripped away the illusion of honor in battle, reducing the war to its rawest, most primal truth: survival or annihilation. Hidden within the volcanic ridges, Japanese officers had prepared for a siege. They built miles of underground tunnels, reinforced with steel doors, ready to fight to the last man. But nothing in their manuals, nothing in the Emperor's code, had prepared them for the sight of fire flowing like water. Some burned alive in their bunkers. Others chose to end their lives by grenade rather than face the agony. Survivors later spoke in trembling voices, saying it felt as if the Americans had brought the sun itself into their caves. Official reports barely mentioned the horror. The flamethrowers were described as effective in clearing fortifications, but eyewitness accounts told another story, of soldiers vomiting from the smell of charred flesh, of men haunted by the screams that echoed even after the fire was gone. A Marine wrote in his diary that he could no longer tell the difference between enemy and inferno, only shadows writhing in the flame. When the sun set over Iwo Jima that day, the beach was littered with blackened silhouettes, twisted remains of men who had fought without fear until the fire came. And somewhere amid the smoke, a new era of psychological warfare was born, one that burned not just the body but the human soul itself. The Pacific Islands had become laboratories of terror, places where the limits of human endurance were tested and broken. Before Iwo Jima, on Peleliu and Saipan, the Americans had already begun to wield fire as a calculated instrument of domination. The flamethrower, once a crude experiment in World War I, had evolved into a weapon of precision and dread. Engineers at the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service had redesigned it to project streams of burning fuel over 50 yards, capable of reaching into tunnels and strongholds once thought impenetrable. The device weighed over 70 pounds, and the man who carried it was a marked target, yet also a symbol of unstoppable destruction. The Japanese called them fire demons. From behind stone bunkers, defenders whispered that no armor or honor could withstand the flame. Propaganda had prepared them to die for the Emperor, to welcome death as duty. But when the flamethrowers came, that sacred conviction faltered. Reports recovered from Japanese diaries after the battles told of soldiers praying for death before the fire reached them. Not for victory, not for honor, but for mercy. One entry found on Guam read simply, "Fire came. The world turned to light. We screamed until there was no more air." The Marines, too, bore the weight of what they unleashed. Those who operated the flamethrowers described the weapon as both power and curse. The heat was unbearable, the smell unforgettable. Some said the fuel's roar seemed to merge with the screams, creating a sound that haunted their dreams for years after. They didn't see enemies. They saw silhouettes writhing in agony, vanishing in seconds. To them, the weapon ended resistance swiftly. But to those who survived the inferno, it created a new kind of nightmare, a terror so complete it broke the will to fight long before death arrived. Military commanders justified its use as a necessity. And every cave cleared by flame meant fewer Marines killed by hidden snipers or grenades. Yet historians would later uncover internal reports that spoke in cautious tones, not of victory, but of the moral cost. The weapon achieves tactical success, one report read, but imposes psychological consequences on operator and observer alike. The true battlefield, it seemed, was no longer just the ground beneath their feet, but the human mind itself. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a series of brutal lessons in adaptation. The Japanese had mastered concealment, building labyrinths beneath the earth, tunnels that connected bunkers, artillery posts, and sleeping quarters. On Iwo Jima alone, there were more than 16 miles of underground passages carved through volcanic rock. Inside those tunnels, soldiers lived like ghosts, invisible to aerial bombardment, ready to emerge and vanish without warning. American commanders realized that no amount of bullets or bombs could root them out completely. Fire, however, could. The flamethrower became the answer to invisibility. Its purpose was not simply to kill. It was to flush the unseen enemy from the dark, to make the hidden visible. Marines carried the weapon like a cross on their backs, its tanks filled with thickened gasoline called napalm, a new compound that clung to skin and burned hotter than anything the world had known. When ignited, it did not simply scorch, it devoured. A single burst could reach temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius, turning oxygen itself into fuel. No bunker, no tunnel, no human body could withstand it. In the Japanese fortifications, soldiers felt the earth itself turning against them. They would hear the dull thud of boots above, the metallic hiss of a valve opening, and then silence before the inferno. One Japanese corporal later recounted from a field hospital that the light was everywhere, the walls screamed, we were buried in fire. His face was so badly burned that even his comrades failed to recognize him. Others never made it out at all, sealed inside molten chambers that would remain untouched until decades later, when archaeologists uncovered their fused remains. For the Americans, success was measured in cleared bunkers. Each operation ended with smoke rising from cave mouths like breath from the earth. But even as commanders reported objectives secured, a darker realization crept through the ranks. The weapon had not just changed the tactics of war, it had changed its soul. A chaplain attached to the 5th Marine Division wrote in his private notes, "We have found a way to burn the unseen, but in doing so, we have burned something inside ourselves as well." The fire that consumed the enemy also began to consume the conscience of those who wielded it. The origins of America's flamethrower program were buried in secrecy, far from the Pacific beaches where the weapon would earn its name in terror. In 1940, years before Pearl Harbor, U.S. Army engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground began experimenting with portable incendiary systems, inspired by captured German designs from the First World War. The Germans had once used crude flame projectors in the trenches of Verdun, terrifying but unreliable. The Americans, with access to superior materials and chemical engineering, sought to perfect what the Reich had only begun. What emerged from those hidden laboratories was the M1A1, a weapon refined through fire and fear. The engineers who built it spoke clinically of fuel consistency and nozzle efficiency. Yet the weapon's purpose was unmistakable: to transform war from gunfire into immolation. Field tests showed that streams of burning fuel could cling to surfaces even underwater. The thickened gasoline mixture, napalm, was developed by Harvard chemists under military contract, its creation quietly celebrated as a triumph of American innovation. Few asked how it would feel when that innovation met human flesh. When the first prototypes were tested on the islands of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, commanders realized they possessed something that could alter the course of close-quarters combat. Japanese soldiers who had once fought fanatically to the last breath began surrendering in panic the moment they saw the tank harness and ignition nozzle. They feared fire more than death, one Marine intelligence report noted. They would rather die by bullet than burn. Yet, for the men who carried the flamethrower, survival was no guarantee. They were the first targets, visible, heavy, and carrying a bomb on their backs. A single shot to the fuel tanks could turn them into living torches. Despite the risk, volunteers stepped for ward. Some were engineers, others just farm boys with steady hands and strong backs. They learned to operate the weapon in silence, to move slowly, to wait for the hiss before the burst. To them, it was not hatred that drove the flame. It was duty. They did not see faces, only openings in rock. But when the fire struck and screams filled the tunnels, even the most hardened Marines admitted that something inside them shifted. They had won the battle for ground, but at the cost of something deeper, something unseen, that no metal could ever restore. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, the flamethrower became more than a weapon. It became a language of dominance. The Japanese defenders, under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had transformed the island into a fortress of death. They refused to meet the Marines in open battle. Instead, they vanished into the rock itself. Thousands of men waited inside tunnels, dugouts, and chambers, listening to the thunder of artillery above. The air was hot and stale, heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and volcanic ash. For days, nothing but silence, until the flamethrowers came. The assault teams moved methodically, pairing the flame units with demolition squads. They approached cave openings slowly, their faces hidden behind goggles and soot. The moment they heard movement inside, a hiss followed, then a burst of roaring flame that lit up the tunnel like a furnace. The sound was deafening, the pressure so intense that it blew the hats off nearby soldiers. Inside, the fire raced along the walls, devouring oxygen and swallowing all sound but the shriek of combustion. The Japanese defenders had no defense. Metal helmets melted, ammunition exploded, entire crews were incinerated before they could fire a single shot. After each attack, silence returned. But it was not peace. The Marines would wait at the entrance for the smoke to clear, their hands shaking as the smell of burned flesh drifted out. They rarely spoke about what they saw inside. Some caves contained only ashes and bones. Others held men frozen in positions of prayer. The enemy had become unrecognizable, melted into the stone that once protected them. A corporal later wrote in his journal, "We entered hell and left it burning." Psychological warfare took its toll on both sides. The Japanese began broadcasting false reports to terrify American troops, claiming that suicide squads would target flamethrower operators. The Marines responded with even more ruthless tactics, sending tanks equipped with flamethrowers, the M4A3R3 Zippo Shermans, to engulf entire cave systems. The sight of those steel monsters spewing rivers of flame broke the last remnants of morale among the defenders. Yet among the Americans, victory felt hollow. The fire had done its work, but in its glow they saw not triumph, only the reflection of what war had turned them into. By the time the U.S. assault reached the heart of Iwo Jima, the island had become an inferno of ash and twisted metal. Entire hillsides flickered at night like embers from a dying volcano. The once proud Japanese garrison, nearly 21,000 men, had dwindled to a few thousand, trapped in their tunnels, refusing to surrender even as the fire crept closer. They clutched grenades to their chests, their faces illuminated by the glow of approaching flame. For many, death by fire was the ultimate disgrace, yet there was no escape. Their emperor's command, "You shall not return alive," had turned the island into a tomb. In one of the surviving diaries found deep within a burned tunnel, a Japanese lieutenant wrote, "The air is fire. We breathe flame. The Americans come with the weapon of the gods. I can hear men screaming in the next chamber. I will not scream." His handwriting trembled, the ink blotted by sweat and soot. He never finished the entry. When recovery teams discovered the tunnel weeks later, it was sealed shut by melted stone. The diary was the only thing left intact. American war photographers documented the aftermath in grim silence. Their cameras captured scenes that never reached newspapers. Caves lined with blackened remains, helmets fused to skulls, weapons warped by heat. Editors back home deemed the images too disturbing for the public. Official communiques spoke only of cleared resistance and heroic advances. Yet those who were there knew that victory had come through horror. Some Marines began to fear the weapon they carried. One operator later confessed that he dreamed of the flame roaring back toward him, swallowing him whole. Military psychiatrists noted a rising number of psychological breakdowns among flamethrower units. Many could not sleep without the sound of hissing fuel in their ears. Others refused to speak about what they had seen, too, their silence as heavy as the tanks they once carried. Commanders rotated them frequently, knowing that prolonged exposure to such warfare shattered even the strongest men. Behind the medals and commendations lay invisible scars, not from burns, but from memory. The flamethrower had conquered Iwo Jima, but it had also burned its way into the souls of those who used it, leaving behind a mark that no victory could erase. When the fires of Iwo Jima faded, Okinawa awaited, the last and most brutal crucible of the Pacific War. In April 1945, nearly 500,000 American troops descended upon the island, unaware that beneath its lush green hills lay an underground world of death. The Japanese had dug an immense warren of caves and tunnels, some stretching for miles, stocked with food, weapons, and medical supplies for a fight to the end. The defenders numbered more than 100,000. Soldiers, students, even civilians pressed into service, all sworn to die before surrender. Against this fanatic defense, the Americans unleashed their most feared weapon once again, the flamethrower. The battle soon dissolved into a nightmare. Rain mixed with fire. Mud hissed as it boiled under napalm's heat. The Marines moved yard by yard, clearing caves with methodical bursts of flame. The air filled with the smell of burnt vegetation, flesh, and the acrid tang of melted steel. The Japanese inside the tunnels fought like trapped animals, their minds fraying as the fire rolled toward them. A captured diary from an Okinawan bunker described it simply. The cave breathes smoke. The walls move. There is no night or day, only flame. Entire families hiding from the bombardment perished in the inferno, consumed alongside soldiers. The moral weight of the campaign began to crush those who fought it. War correspondents later described flamethrower teams as men aged beyond their years, their eyes distant and cold. Some Marines refused to operate the weapon anymore, shaken by the screams echoing from within the caves. Others became grimly efficient, detached, and silent, executing their task as if possessed. Officers noted that their behavior shifted in strange ways after each operation. Sudden laughter, long silences, trembling hands. The fire that conquered Okinawa had begun to consume the hearts of those who wielded it. By the time the island was declared secure, more than 100,000 Japanese lay dead. The flamethrower had done its work, burning out fortifications, bunkers, hospitals, and every last fragment of resistance. Yet when the battle ended, the victorious soldiers stood among smoldering ruins and realized something terrible. The weapon that gave them power had stripped them of humanity. The flames had not just defeated an enemy, they had burned away the last illusions of glory from the war itself. After Okinawa, the Pacific Islands were silent, not with peace, but with exhaustion. Every ridge, every blackened cave carried the ghosts of what had happened there. The war was nearing its end, but the flamethrower's legacy had already written itself into the bones of those islands. American engineers and intelligence officers began collecting data, not just about tactics, but about the psychological effects of flame on enemy morale. It was no longer simply a weapon. It was a scientific instrument of terror. Reports classified as restricted detailed the behavior of Japanese soldiers under fire, how they froze, screamed, or fled, how even the most fanatical units broke formation when they saw the tanks with the long metal nozzles approach. Behind closed doors, military psychologists examined these findings. They concluded that fire invoked something deeper than fear of death. It awakened primal terror, the same instinct that drove ancient men from volcanic eruptions and lightning strikes. Commanders began to speak in detached tones of psychological saturation, the point at which an enemy's will to fight disintegrated. In those sterile reports, the horror of Okinawa was reduced to statistics. But among the Marines, the truth could not be measured in charts. The smell, the heat, the cries, those remained. Captured Japanese officers later testified that the flamethrower changed everything. One described watching his entire platoon engulfed in flame, their uniforms melting as they tried to escape. "It was not war," he said. "It was the end of the world." Others spoke of soldiers who begged to be shot rather than burned, of men who clawed at the walls until their hands were bone. These accounts were quietly stored in intelligence archives, labeled too disturbing for release. Even decades later, few were ever made public. For the Americans, the weapon became bad, of necessity and curse. It cleared caves, ended battles faster, and saved lives, yet each use deepened the moral abyss. Veterans who had wielded the flamethrower rarely spoke of it after the war. In interviews years later, some admitted they avoided campfires and stoves because the smell of burning fuel brought the memories back. Others confessed they never forgot the sound. That deep, sucking roar that marked the moment when humanity gave way to horror. The weapon had ended countless fights, but it had left behind an unending one within the souls of those who used it. As the Pacific Campaign drew to its apocalyptic finale, the weapon of fire prepared for its most terrifying evolution. American strategists, already planning the invasion of Japan's home islands, envisioned entire divisions equipped with flamethrower tanks and portable units, thousands of them. Operation Downfall, as it was called, would have unleashed a storm of fire across the Japanese mainland unlike anything seen in human history. Engineers at Fort Belvoir and Aberdeen refined new systems capable of continuous bursts, longer ranges, and chemical additives that clung to surfaces like tar. They called it thickened inferno fuel. Others called it what it truly was: the weaponization of hell. But the invasion never came. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war ended before the flamethrower's final act could be performed. Yet deep within Pentagon archives, documents revealed that napalm-based weapons were intended to cover urban districts, forests, and entire villages, an unrelenting blaze meant to purge any resistance. The psychological lessons learned from Iwo Jima and Okinawa were ready to be applied on a national scale. Japan would not just have been defeated, it would have been burned from the inside out. Even without that invasion, the legacy of those experiments spread. The same napalm compounds and ignition systems were quietly shipped to Europe for study, forming the basis of post-war incendiary research. By 1947, as the Cold War began to simmer, both superpowers kept detailed records of thermal area denial weapons, a sanitized phrase for flamethrowers, firebombs, and napalm clusters. What had begun as a weapon against bunkers was evolving into a doctrine of terror from the sky. The fire that once roared through caves would soon fall upon cities. In Japan, survivors who had hidden through the island battles emerged from the ashes to find the land transformed. Farmers unearthed bones fused into glassy rock. Melted helmets protruded from the soil like relics of some vanished civilization. Children were told never to play in the old tunnels, not because of ghosts, but because of what lay trapped inside. The residues of a weapon that had burned hotter than morality itself. For the world, the atomic bomb became the face of horror. But in the jungles and caves of the Pacific, fire had already shown what mankind was capable of long before the mushroom cloud rose. When the war ended in August 1945, the flamethrower was quietly retired from glory. It was paraded in victory exhibitions, displayed as a tool of technological triumph. Yet its true story remained hidden behind censored reports and silent veterans. Official films showed its efficiency in clearing enemy fortifications, but the footage was edited, the screams removed, the bodies cropped out, the flame shown only at a distance. Behind the public narrative of victory, the military buried thousands of classified pages detailing the human toll of fire warfare, not on the enemy, but on those who used it. Psychiatric evaluations from the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps documented a peculiar pattern among flamethrower operators. Many suffered recurring nightmares of suffocation, of being trapped in burning tunnels. Others reported phantom smells, fuel, flesh, smoke, years after leaving the battlefield. One report from 1946 concluded, "The act of burning a living opponent causes profound emotional dissociation. The operator becomes detached from self-identity. Commanders called it combat fatigue." But the truth was far darker. Fire had not only destroyed the enemy, it had consumed the boundaries of conscience. Meanwhile, in Japan, the survivors of those underground infernos faced their own silence. Few spoke of what they had witnessed. In villages across Kyushu and Shikoku, burned veterans returned from island garrisons disfigured beyond recognition. The imperial government offered no recognition, no compensation. Their service, though loyal, was considered dishonored, not because they had fought poorly, but because they had died in fire rather than by their own hand. Among them spread a whisper, Kaji no Tatakai, the war of fire. For them, it had been more than a battle. It was a descent into a man-made hell. American historians, eager to shape a narrative of victory, avoided the subject. The word flamethrower appeared less frequently in textbooks, overshadowed by atomic headlines. The moral questions it raised, questions of humanity, of cruelty, of psychological ruin, were quietly set aside in favor of technological pride. Yet beneath the silence, a grim truth endured. The flamethrower had revealed something atomic power never could. The bomb killed cities. Fire destroyed the soul, one body at a time. And when the war was over, both victors and vanquished carried the same scar. The memory of men who brought the sun to earth and watched it consume everything. In the years that followed, the flame refused to die. Though the battlefield had changed, the weapons spirit lived on in laboratories and factories. The Cold War's beginning brought new funding for incendiary research, another euphemism for perfecting methods of controlled immolation. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps expanded its testing grounds in Maryland, Utah, and the Pacific, experimenting with improved fuels that burned longer, hotter, and adhered to targets through rain and wind. Harvard's chemists, who once mixed napalm in secrecy, now refined compounds for mass production. Fire had become a science, predictable, measurable, and repeatable. The lessons of the Pacific were studied in detail. Analysts concluded that fear induced by flame is more effective than fear induced by explosives. Memos circulated among high command, arguing that the psychological impact of fire on an enemy force was strategically invaluable. But behind the strategic language, some officers recoiled. A classified memorandum from 1948 warned, "The human reaction to sustained fire exposure exceeds moral comprehension. It cannot be mitigated by training or propaganda." The report was buried, a relic of conscience in an age increasingly dominated by calculation. Meanwhile, veterans returned home to a country eager to celebrate heroes, not survivors haunted by what they'd seen. The men who had carried the flamethrowers rarely spoke of their service. Some destroyed their wartime photos. Others avoided reunions. The flame had followed them into civilian life, into their dreams, into the smell of gasoline, into the simple act of striking a match. Their silence became its own monument. In small towns across America, medals tarnished quietly on shelves while the memories behind them burned unseen. Yet in the shadows of military archives, the truth endured. Secret after-action reports described battlefields so scorched that metal liquefied and bones turned to ash within seconds. Marines who once spoke proudly of clearing caves later confessed that they could never forget the look of the fire as it crawled, slow, deliberate, almost intelligent, into the dark. One veteran said, decades later, "It wasn't war, it was a cleansing, but it cleansed nothing." And in those words lay the essence of what the Pacific Flame had truly created, not victory, but an indelible scar across the conscience of mankind. By the 1950s, the weapon that had terrified the Pacific was reborn under a new name, flame projector, mechanized. The same engineers who once designed portable flamethrowers now turned their expertise to mounted systems. Armored vehicles fitted with high-pressure pumps capable of casting fire over hundreds of feet. The M67 Zippo tank, named after the lighter that never failed to ignite, became the modern embodiment of that same infernal weapon. Its first deployments were not in the Pacific, but in the jungles of Southeast Asia. What began on the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima returned in the green shadows of Vietnam. In villages hidden among the rice paddies, history repeated itself. The roar of napalm canisters falling from aircraft, the screams of those caught beneath them, the sight of entire tree lines erupting into flame. It was the same weapon, perfected and multiplied. The same reports followed, enemy morale shattered, objectives achieved, victory claimed. Yet the human cost was again immeasurable. Soldiers spoke of fields turned to liquid fire, of streams running red and orange, of children's voices lost beneath the roar. What the flamethrower had done to bunkers, napalm now did to nations. American soldiers trained with manuals that described the weapon's area denial effectiveness, its thermal radius, and its strategic deterrent value. None mentioned the smell, the screams, or the silence that followed. The doctrine of fire had become detached from its horror, absorbed into the mechanical language of modern war. Still, among the troops, old ghosts whispered. Veterans of the Pacific, now older officers, recognized the familiar glow in the night sky and felt the same sickness in their hearts. They had seen it before, decades earlier, on a black island far from home. Photographs from Vietnam, unlike those suppressed in 1945, could no longer be hidden. The world saw the fire this time, the naked terror on human faces, the rivers of flame consuming forests. Outrage spread, but behind closed doors, military officials defended the weapon's lineage as necessary evolution. The truth, however, remained unchanged. The flamethrower had not died in the ashes of Iwo Jima. It had simply grown wings. And though the world condemned its use, the image of fire raining from the sky was not an aberration of war. It was the inevitable continuation of an idea first born in those caves where men learned to wield flame like a god. As the decades passed, the soldiers who once carried the fire aged into silence. Many went to their graves without speaking a word about what they had done. Their children and grandchildren would know them only as quiet men who flinched at fireworks, who stared too long into campfires, who left the room when newsreels showed footage of burning jungles. The world celebrated them as heroes, but they lived with memories that no medal could redeem. In hidden diaries, discovered years later in attics and trunks, some of them tried to put words to the guilt that haunted them. One Marine wrote simply, "I burned men alive, and the war never ended." Those who studied the Pacific Campaign in the years that followed began to uncover what official histories had left out. Military censors during the war had ordered thousands of photographs and film reels destroyed. Images of charred bodies, of caves glowing like furnaces, of civilians caught in the blast. Correspondence between field commanders and Washington revealed a quiet unease. Even the architects of victory knew that something irretrievable had been lost in the fire. One general's letter, declassified in the 1970s, read, "I fear we have awakened something older than war, a hunger that cannot be fed without consuming the soul." In Japan, the scars were different but no less enduring. Archaeologists excavating the old tunnel systems on Saipan and Iwo Jima found walls blackened by flame, bones fused together, relics of men who died without burial rites. Local priests refused to enter some of the caves, calling them Kaji no Haka, the graves of fire. Survivors who had been children during the island sieges spoke of the nightmares that still visited them, the roar, the heat, the blinding light that filled every corner of the world. Time had not dulled the memory. It had only buried it beneath decades of silence. Governments on both sides preferred it that way. To remember meant to confront what humanity had become when it learned to use fire not as a tool of survival, but as a language of annihilation. The Pacific War was over. The weapons had been stored away, their nozzles rusting in museums. But the knowledge, the method, the science, the will, remained alive, passed quietly from one generation of strategists to the next. The flame had become part of us, and like all things born of fear, it waited only to be called upon again. By the dawn of the 21st century, the flamethrower had become a relic, obsolete in name yet immortal in spirit. Nations no longer carried tanks of napalm on their backs. Instead, they built weapons that delivered the same consuming heat from miles away. Thermobaric bombs, white phosphorus shells, and precision-guided incendiaries carried the torch where men once walked. The principle had not changed. To suffocate, to burn, to erase. Modern warfare had only made it cleaner on paper, more detached, more efficient. The human hand no longer needed to hold the flame. Machines did it now, without hesitation or conscience. Declassified Pentagon documents from the early 2000s revealed that much of the research behind these new, enhanced blast munitions traced directly back to the Pacific Theater's findings. The psychological studies of enemy panic under flame had evolved into algorithms predicting shock thresholds, the scientific measurement of fear. The lessons learned in the caves of Iwo Jima were alive in computer models used to design modern battle doctrine. In the sterile language of progress, the horror had been rebranded as data. Yet for those who remembered, the fire was not forgotten. The last surviving flamethrower operators, frail and white-haired, spoke in halting tones during rare interviews. One veteran, nearing his 90th year, said, "The weapon never left me. I smell it when it rains." He described the moment he watched a cave ignite, how the fire seemed to move with intent, to search, to consume. His eyes welled as he whispered, "We thought we were winning. But the fire won." In Japan, memorials were quietly erected at the sites of the burned caves. They bore no names, only inscriptions. "May the fire never come again." Visitors left offerings, rice, incense, and sometimes small paper cranes blackened at the edges. These memorials were rarely covered by media, overshadowed by the grand monuments of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet they marked a truth equally profound, that not all horrors needed the atom to reveal the abyss within mankind. In those silent caverns where stone still bore the scars of 1945, the echo of the flamethrower lingered, the breath of a weapon that had burned itself into human memory, too dark for triumph, too real to forget. Time buried the memories, but it could not erase the smell of fire from history. Beneath every tale of valor and victory lay the unspoken reality of what that weapon truly was, a symbol of mankind's willingness to wield creation itself as punishment. As archives opened and once classified reports surfaced, historians began to reconstruct the story that official documents had tried to sanitize. They found test logs describing the burn radius of human dummies, reports noting how fire clung to the skin, and letters from medical officers detailing the impossible task of treating napalm burns. The documents spoke without emotion, but between the lines lived the agony of those who had seen what the numbers represented. In one forgotten report, a U.S. Army surgeon wrote, "There are no clean wounds with flame. Flesh liquefies, bones char, and there is no mercy in morphine." He had treated both Marines and Japanese prisoners, each burned beyond recognition, both begging for the same thing: death. Those notes never reached the public. They were stored away, buried under layers of classification, their reality too grotesque for a world desperate to believe in noble wars. Even the veterans' hospitals tried to hide them, labeling the victims of accidental flame injuries as training mishaps, rather than remnants of the Pacific's infernal weapon. But in the private recollections of those who carried it, the truth endured. One Marine, interviewed in the 1980s, described his first mission on Peleliu. "You hear them before you see them. The screams don't stop when the flame does. They echo in your head. You can't sleep because you still see the light." He paused, then added, "I never hated them. I hated what we had to do to them." His words captured what the official records never could, that beneath every order, beneath every tactical success, burned the same question: what part of humanity survives after wielding that kind of power? The war's historians still debate whether the flamethrower saved lives by ending battles faster. Perhaps it did, but the cost was written not in numbers but in silence. The silence of men who returned home and never spoke again. They had looked into the heart of man's oldest fear and seen it staring back through fire. And in that reflection, the line between victory and damnation vanished forever. When the war finally ended and the world exhaled in relief, the fires of the Pacific still burned, not in jungles or caves, but in the minds of those who had witnessed them. The flamethrower, that instrument of terror and survival, was locked away, its fuel tanks rusting in forgotten depots, its legacy sealed behind military silence. Yet history does not bury its ghosts so easily. Decades later, when veterans of both sides met at reconciliation ceremonies, they rarely shook hands at first. Their eyes met, and in that quiet understanding, the same memory flickered. The unbearable light of living flame. American troops who had once carried the weapon often refused to speak of it in public. In their diaries, they confessed guilt that no metal could ease. One entry from a Marine corporal read, "It wasn't war anymore after the first cave. It was judgment. The flame judged everyone." On the other side, Japanese survivors described the horror of hearing the weapon before seeing it, a hiss like the breath of hell, followed by a wall of orange that devoured air itself. Some had buried themselves under sand or mud to escape the heat, only to suffocate moments later. In post-war years, as reconstruction turned ashes into cities, the world sought to forget the instruments that had delivered such suffering. History books spoke of battles, strategies, and victories, but seldom of the weapon that erased faces, melted bunkers, and turned courage into ash. Yet the silence spoke volumes. In every soldier's trembling hand, in every blackened crater, in every prayer for the burned, the truth endured. That civilization had flirted with its own extinction, one burst of fire at a time. Now, in archives and memorials, the story survives, fragile, scorched, but unbroken. The flamethrower remains both a testament to human ingenuity and a warning of its limits. It proved that fear could be weaponized, that science could serve horror as easily as it served hope. And in that realization lies the forbidden heart of the Pacific War, that victory was not measured by ground gained or enemies defeated, but by the shadow it left on the human soul. In the silence that follows every flame, one truth endures. The fire never truly went out. It simply moved inside us,